Stephen Barrett is a barrister at Radcliffe Chambers who read law at Oxford and taught it at Cambridge, and this is what he had to say. The starting point in the COVID rules should be Section 73 of the Public Health Control of Disease Act 1984. Now, this part of the regulations at all times says that it did not apply to Crown land. And Crown land, of course, includes number 10. Well, I'm delighted to say that Stephen Barrett can join us now on the programme. When you put an exemption like that, and clearly it does say that in that Public Health Act, it does sound a bit weaselly, doesn't it? That sort of none of these rules applied anyway, so they can all get away with it.
Well, one of the things I like to do is to leave the politics to everybody else and just do the law. So what you think about any of this is politics and is for you. What I'd say about the Crown exemption is that to me it makes perfect sense, because we've been through, as novel as COVID was to all of us, as a human society, and remember ours is sort of 800 years old of law, basically untouched and evolving little bit at a time. It makes perfect sense to me that in a quarantine, which is what this is, you'd have a basic proposition that the government wouldn't be caught by the quarantine laws. And you'd have a catch-all provision to make sure that the government was never caught by it. And that's for a very simple reason. You need the state to function, you need government to function. What if we got invaded? We can't really have, civil servants running around worrying about whether or not they're breaching technical rules. We need government to function. So that's the Crown exemption point that I published on. That's my article, and there we are. There's then a second legal test, which is sort of being messed up a little bit, because at the moment the politics of all this, and you've just had a very gifted MP, former MP, on your programme doing the politics, it needs the law to be certain. It sort of, it desperately wants, and Stephen Pound wrongly used the phrase, and it's quite an extraordinary phrase really, that the Prime Minister has been found guilty by the police. Now that just is not our constitution. We do not have the police finding people guilty. And certainly paying a fixed penalty notice does not mean you have been found guilty of anything. So
that's interesting. Stephen Barrett, let's just bring Stephen Pound back in on that question. Stephen Pound, what do you say to that the Prime Minister hasn't actually been found guilty by the police?
Well, so it's a great line. I must try it next time I get a speeding ticket or something. I mean, the fact remains that if you are fined under the law and you pay that fine, that is an admission of guilt. End of.
Stephen Barrett.
No, that's an error. So we're not going to have a fun debate on this, because that's just...
No, you're qualified and I'm not.
But it doesn't matter really. The point is that we're emphasising that politics has different requirements from the law. And so I've explained the general Crown immunity and why I think that makes sense in our legal system. The second one is this is a legal test of what is reasonably necessary for work purposes. Now, I know law can be a little bit dull, so just stick with me for a second. Reasonably necessary for work purposes strikes me, and it struck Lord Sumption, as quite a low test. If you want a high-level test, you'd write something like essential for work purposes, or absolutely essential for work purposes. Because one of the things that the law must do, that politics doesn't necessarily have to do, is that law needs to be consistent. And if we're going to draw a line saying that, having a cake appear at a meeting is not reasonably necessary for work purposes, well, then it is a fag break reasonably necessary for work purposes. Because I think it is. And, is smiling reasonably necessary for work purposes? Yes, I think smiling is perfectly necessary, reasonable for work purposes. It's why I prefer. So the Met Police are taking a different line from me, perfectly fair to highlight. They as law, do not agree with my legal position. They don't agree with Lord Sumption. They also appear to be in disagreement with Durham Police. As Durham Police, and we've all seen the Starmer photos, and there's a little video. You can watch him chatting away merrily and drinking his beer, and we can see the takeaway. Durham Police have, I think, rightly taken the position of, one, we don't investigate historic offences. Now, as law, that seems consistent and rightly applied, and the proper position. The Metropolitan Police have not taken that position. Durham Police have also as far as we can tell, taken the position that having a beer at work or a takeaway at work, once you've all been working together, then that is reasonably necessary for work purposes. And that seems to me to be absolutely right. Reasonably necessary for work purposes is, I think, a very low bar. So there's both the
that is a contested point, of course, because, as you rightly say, that's your interpretation. The Met Police seem to have another, and I should say the QC Adam Wagner, who is often popping up on media, takes the opposite view as well. Stephen Pound, what do you make of this, the idea that this isn't an absolute, this is a contested situation, and it's not always clear-cut as to whether or not someone has actually breached these rules or not?
Well, if everything was Manichean and clear-cut, barristers would be out of a job, which, heaven forfend. But the reality is that the Metropolitan Police have investigated and they have acted. To come out with the old, the Crown exemption argument, I think, is nonsense. Don't forget that they used to find cocaine in the House of Lords, but they couldn't prosecute the person who had it, because it was a royal palace. So you can't die in the House of Commons. If you die there, you die on the way to St Thomas's Hospital. But, there's all that. I think your word weaselly is absolutely appropriate. But the question about the different standards of proof, I mean, the thing in the City of Durham, in the constituency with Keir Starmer, he has a mask on, he takes the mask off. He drinks from a bottle of beer, puts the bottle of beer down, puts the mask back on again. It was in a room, ventilated, with open windows, with 4 people in the room. Totally different for a whole lot of people.
But doesn't that sound just like all of those Tory MPs who pop up on the media and make all of these excuses, reasonable though they might be? And, of course, I don't think that Keir Starmer should get a fixed penalty notice. I probably don't think that Rishi Sunak should have got a fixed penalty notice either.
I agree with you there.
Which is interesting, because then you disagree with the Met Police seem to have taken a very, very draconian interpretation of what those rules were. And it seems to be inconsistent with how they've been applied elsewhere.
I think in many ways what the Met Police did is what, if you go to Magistrates Court, if you know any JPs, there's a thing about a pattern of behaviour, and it's the pattern of behaviour here. Very often, the police do actually have amount of leeway, and I think, with the Starmer case, there was no pattern of behaviour. He wasn't bringing suitcases full of booze in from the Strand on a regular basis.
Staffers were accused of that, to be fair, not the Prime Minister himself. I'm afraid
I withdraw that.
Well, we are running to the end of this conversation. Let's just give the final word to Stephen Barrett there. On this situation, and particularly on whether or not why the Met Police might have been quite so draconian in their interpretation.
Well, it's right that you highlight Adam. You've flattered him by elevating him to be a QC, which he's not, and he has a good sense of humour.
My mistake. He just
matter of time.
But the point now is the fixed penalty notices have been paid. They're not an admission of guilt. This is a moving on point. It seems to be the next bit where the politics is going to intersect with the law is on whether the Prime Minister has misled the House. And I think that is on a hiding to nothing. Because if all the Prime Minister has to do is say, I read Stephen Barrett's article in The Spectator and I reasonably believe I hadn't broken the law. Or he can say, I listened to Lord Sumption on The World at 1, and I didn't, and that because of that, I did not believe I had broken the law, so I have not misled the House. And that's perfectly acceptable. We worry a lot about legal certainty, and my clients often want legal certainty. We often can't give it as lawyers. This is the very lowest sort of level of certainty. No court of law has looked at these legal arguments, not even a sort of low-level court, certainly not the Supreme Court. I've taken a stance on it. I'm happy to stand by my stance on it. Lord Sumption's taken a stance on it. Adam takes a different one. The idea that anybody who sided with either of us was lying is, I think, just going to fail.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows, and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.